Oh, hello, Elden Ring lore enjoyer. Yeah, we got a lore video for you today. So I'm gonna try to use all the stuff that we know from in the game and connect the dots where I need to, and sometimes I'll probably just make some crap up too. But I'll try to be accurate when I can. And I'm not an expert in any of these historical topics that I will be talking about, so just FYI, my level of expertise is I look on Wikipedia, like unless I forget, and nobody's checking, so YouTube. So something this game uses as a bit of a storytelling mechanic. Going around one of these giant elevators, it's kind of like we're going back in time. Not literally, but more in like a geological sense. And then this geological time is sort of becomes historical, I don't know. And when we go underground in this game, we find some ancient ruins. Probably the easiest point of reference there is just to think of ancient Greece for most people. I mean, that'll give you an idea of what the ruins look like, and the game just borrows this visually. And this ancient Greek looking style of ruins is just one style of ancient ruins in the game. There's several different styles. But this particular style of ruins we could probably associate with like the classical period of ancient Greece. So this is the period that's around, Socrates, that whole time. But the classical period actually followed like a long dark ages that was happening in Greece. And generally these dark ages followed the collapse of the Bronze Age. But in the Bronze Age, one of the major civilizations was the Minoans. And these Minoans might be the reference point or the inspiration for our Numan characters. Or at least they're one inspiration. There tends to be like multiple inspirations for these various game elements, as we will see a little later. But importantly, this Bronze Age civilization would meet its end over time historically, and that's the other important part that's being borrowed from that history. But in the game, we have just no idea what happened to these Numan in their original world, but we know they came here, so probably they were fleeing their home world for some reason. Or maybe they were just expanding the franchise, who knows. In the character creation dialogue, we can choose to be Numan, and when we do that, it says in the description that descended from denizens of another world. To me, it just kind of means that they must be aliens. I mean, it could be more generally just foreigner or other, but it definitely has an alien feel to it. They definitely look human, but I think it's certainly implied that they're not. But now I just want to talk about the word Numan itself, because I think there's something kind of strange going on. So I don't think Numan is the same thing as Minoan. Like, I don't think these are the same types of words, really. So I think, for example, the term Minoan would be like a proper name, because this is like the name of these people. Or at least maybe it's a name referring to a people who don't exist anymore. And I think a term like Numan is kind of like a proper name, but it's a proper name that's like created by somebody else who's not the Numan themselves. That way it could be more like a slang term almost. So whatever these Numan would have called themselves in their own language, in their own place, like we have no idea. We just call them Numan because we don't know. Maybe it's not even possible for humans to, pronounce ghost alien words. And it could be similar to the Minoans, that just over time, whatever cultural identity these people once had just becomes lost for whatever reason. And if you look at all the other options in the character creation presets, none of them are actually called anything that's like a real name. Instead, we've got these kind of folksy nickname type things. Oh, and an interesting thing to think about there is we're talking about these Minoans, like they're associated with these, like the bull and the bull horns, like I mean, if you had a folksy name for them, it might just be something like the Horn Folk. Oh, but I don't want to go off on that tangent. We're going to stick to the plot here. But according to the wiki, the Japanese term for Numan adds a little bit more context and flavor to this whole situation. This version of the term Numan has some origins in the folklore of some Japanese people. And in this folklore, there would be spiritual beings who would visit the inhabitants of coastal communities. Since these were spiritual alien beings from a faraway land, there's a certain connection there. And also these strange spiritual beings would bring the villagers gifts. And I think that's how it must have appeared to these first people who first encountered these Numan. Because if they did arrive from another world, well, there must have been some significant arrival event. And the biggest one the game hints at is obviously these stone boat coffins that we get in the DLC area. Because we already know that coffins are means of transportation and boats are just like giant coffins. So there you go. Coffin magic is boat magic. So do these Numan arrive from another world, like a different planet? Or is it possible that a different world means something more like the spirit world? On the Health and Steeples sword, it does talk about a spirit realm, so maybe there is a spirit world in the game. There isn't too much that really talks about it besides that object. So I think we can associate the Numan with the spiritual realm. Maybe also an alien realm as well. Like, why not? We could just match those things together. But it seems to make some sense that the Numan are some type of space ghost like this. Definitely not human, I guess we could say. Okay, and then the last part is just, Queen Marica is descended from these alien ghosts. That's basically it. So Oh, and alien ghosts are transported by large stone coffin boats. That's where she comes from. Well, at least that's where she was originated. She was later transformed by the horn scent and some other ritual, but that's a different story altogether. Because of course Marica was not just a Numan, she was this Empyrean Numan. So she was an Empyrean Numan transformed by the horn scent. End of mystery. Oh, except wait, there's something also about a tree that we haven't talked about yet. It's pretty important, I guess. So if we take these separate pictures on this obelisk and we kind of read them in order, it maybe tells us the story of what's going on. Top portion of this obelisk we actually see in two different forms, and that's, I'm not sure why there's two different versions of this thing, but there is. So on one version of this, the origin is our stone coffin boats that we find in the DLC, like these are clearly the same thing. And the other version of this, we see this sort of mirrored scene where we've got these 5 figures that are mirrored about some central symbol. And the symbol is fairly abstract. I couldn't tell you exactly what this thing represents, but if anything, it's like some sort of alien spirit force magic, maybe. And interestingly, we find both versions of this first part of the story shown in the Grand Cloister area, which is very deep underground. And it's possible that this Lake of Rot Grand Cloister area was just like an earlier point in their history as well, like maybe some of the earliest times in this Numan history. And we don't know who these 5 figures are. They're just mysterious 5 figures. But we can certainly connect these 5 figures with these stone boat coffins. And they're misinterpreting this because the images are interchanged. The second picture from the top of the obelisk is going to be the same on both of these different versions, and so are all the rest of the pictures actually after that point. But this one shows several people tending to plants or maybe trees. Some of them are reaching into these plants and it looks like they're gathering things. The buds on these plants, they sort of remind me of the things that we see in Caelid as well, like those large bud formations. And those things, like relative to these people, are like apple size. So, I mean, if these are the buds that we find in Caelid, then maybe these people are like giant-sized people. Maybe this tree that they're just picking apples from is like a giant tree, possibly. Maybe these giants eat these buds off these trees, so maybe that's what's going on. And there's nothing that really tells us directly that, you know, there's little baby people growing inside these buds, but I think there's some possibility of that at least. These Numan people were sometimes growing inside of these buds, possibly. And if these ancient giants were eating these buds, it might explain why we find the ancient giant skeletons where we find these buds growing in Caelid. Now let's move to the third part of this story. This has got several figures standing around what looks like a table, I would say. Like there's something table-sized in front of them, or maybe like an altar, or something like an altar or coffin or table. But the central point of this picture is these things that seem to be on the table. Like, what are these figures? So considering this comes after our farming picture, we might consider this like a harvest type of picture, like it seems to just follow from that naturally. However, what's being harvested here is not entirely clear, and who's doing the harvesting also. Like, it seems like giants are harvesting these trees, so like, what's going on? So are these people that are standing over top of this table meant to be these same giants? Like, it would seem like that's implied, right? Whoever these figures are, the figures that are on the table are smaller than they are, so it just gives me the impression that these are probably like children. The only thing we can say for sure is that they seem to be a smaller size. So if it was these same giants, maybe all the giants' kids died for some reason, maybe? Or maybe these people are not the giants and they're somebody else entirely, like the Numans. But then this picture might be saying something like the Numans had like a high birth mortality rate or something like that. And then it's kind of like what to do with all these Numan remains. Well, I guess you just feed them back to the tree, right? Like that's what they would probably do. I think another direction we can go with this is just to consider these Numan sacrifices, and we're looking at something a little bit different in that case. So these Numan would sacrifice their young, essentially. And this would turn into the whole demigod thing later, where we of course find headless remains in the mausoleums. These are dead demigods. These are sacrificed children. Maybe it's a combination of both. Maybe we've got child sacrifice and we've got dead demigods combined here. There are many story themes that kind of all collide right there. Summarize these, so far we've got this arrival, we've got this farming scene, and then we've got a sacrifice happening. And the biggest problem is, again, of course, we don't know who anybody is, so let's move to the fourth scene now. This one follows a similar mirrored pattern as our first scene, but in place of the abstract Elden Beast alien symbol, tree symbol, we've got instead the throne symbol. There could be a lot of ways to go with that, but the way I'm going to connect it for now is just the idea that, so this is just the Elden throne, this is the seat of power in the land. But the mirrored people in the scene, I think, tell us a little bit more than the previous ones did, because they're in different positions. Let's have a look at that now. The figure closest to the chair appears to be holding something about the size of a baby. This is also indicated by the way it's sort of being held by this figure, although it could be some object of similar size and weight. Second from this person, we find a little bit of variation, but in every case we find someone who seems to be kind of like on their knees. So groveling for mercy might be, one description, but there's several emotes in the game that are kind of similar. How might we interpret this? Well, the one closest to the throne is this one holding the baby. The people who are groveling for mercy may have some connection with atonement, and the remaining figures just kind of look on, and they may have some sort of large jar in their hand. But all these things taken together, are just, to me, it seems there's some sort of conflict going on here, and that the conflict is just centered around the throne. And then the final picture now, we've got 7 figures with one central figure. All of them seem to be holding something in their arms that looks like to be about the size of a baby. And besides that, they all have these kind of strange hats on, I guess. That's about the only thing I could say there. Oh, and there's pillars between all these people. It's the same type of pillar that we see the horn scent, I guess, kind of worshipping in this one area. They have a similar cross-hatched pattern on the pillars. We mentioned that the arches between these pillars are the more rounded style, not the more pointed style that we see sometimes. So we've seen a progression in these symmetrical images. The first one we had the symbol of the Elden beast or the Elden ring. Second we had the image of the chair. And now third we've got this image of the central largest figure. This has got to be probably the Lord figure, I would imagine. But if we notice on this fifth position where we got these baby holding hat wearing wizards. So we've got the central wizard and he's a little bit larger, and then we've got the outside wizards who are all kind of the same, but they're like smaller than the central wizard. And we see that same figure closest to the throne and interpret him as the Lord figure. I think we could put these together and just connect the idea that the Lord's going to be the largest character, or like the strongest is going to win, basically, right? And that's where the underground story ends. So let's just summarize the 5 pictures again and see if we get any kind of new idea here. So the Numan came, they brought their plants. Or if anyone didn't bring these magical plants, the magical plants could have already been here. They just did their magical thing. They're probably giants are eating all their babies, and that was a problem. But they also find out that there's more magical power in these sort of like horribly sacrificed remains. They gain power from the dead. This power from the dead would fuel some kind of political power struggle over who controls the plant magic, I guess. And somehow that struggle would result in this what seems to be kind of basic hierarchy where the strongest lord would be the ruling one. But there definitely is something strange going on in the way, since we have this direct connection with these pillars that we find in the Shadowlands, I think we have to connect that, after this 5th scene, we have what takes place after in the Shadowlands in terms of like ruins. So we could ask what happened to these dude wizards and their little babies, and that's, a different story. Let's come back to where I started here with the idea of like proper names and things, and talk about another one of these words that we might think is a proper name, but again, it's not. This time I'm talking about the term shaman. Just like how I think the term Numan is not what those people would have called themselves. Shaman is a different type of term. It's more of a term of status, actually. Or if you don't like status, job title or like role in society. And I'm certainly no expert in any kind of religious study, but my basic understanding of shamanism is kind of like a worldwide practiced religion in a way, even though they're all separate and distinct. They all kind of have similar beliefs. And just to summarize one of these beliefs, the world has a spiritual side that exists, and they have ways of communicating with the spiritual world. And through this communication with the spirit world, they can, affect the lives of the living in good ways or bad ways, however they choose to do it. So they have basically like spirit magic, and just like a very general form of this was present in all kinds of like ancient religions in real human history. This directly connects actually to some lore in the game I talked about previously, because in the game we know magical power is associated with the remains of the dead, and the more valuable the dead, the more powerful that magic will be. But back in reality, so in these societies, like they would have a priest figure, and outside of those societies we would just call that priest figure a shaman because of their connection to this idea of shamanism. And back in the game, we have one concrete example in the ancestral followers who we know like directly practice this type of belief. And we see this curiously manifest in the symbol of a skull. It's the skull of one of these like regal ancestral beasts, like one of the babies. It seems possible that these ancestral followers are using their magic to, bring animals back to life, basically. If only not exactly back to life, just kind of sprouting new ones off of the bodies of the old ones. So to me, this reminds me of crucible magic, and maybe that's what we're looking at here. I think in terms of how these two things are presented with the ancestral followers and these old ruins of this Minoan-like civilization of the Numans, because they're presented together, I think it's just implied that the ancestral followers were the people that were here first, basically. So, but these ancestral followers are also referred to as shaman in all of their clothing descriptions. So that's not to say they're the same thing as Marica in Shaman Village, just that they have the same kind of job title. So Marica was a kind of Numan descended shaman, and the ancestral followers are a shaman descended from some other tradition. They would both be really attuned into this life force magic, which is probably the same thing as the crucible. The point is, there's all kinds of wizards out there, and shaman is just one type of wizard. The shaman is the type of wizard that's connected to like spirit magic. So the shaman has some control over sickness and health. And then just to exaggerate sickness and health, you just got like life and death, basically, right? And this should just make you think of doctors, because I mean, shamans are kind of like the original doctors. And doctors are also associated with the snake imagery. We know a couple pretty common symbols associated with snakes, as well as snake imagery being associated with oh man, I'm spiraling off. What are the Numan descended shaman all about? So here it seems to be we have to go back to this tree theory again. So there I think that new Numan are created somehow with tree magic. So it requires like a special tree that they probably tend to, and the tree just allows them to, basically resurrect to create new people. And maybe they're just clones of themselves. See, these wizards might be like Dr.Evil and Mini-Me, like it could be that kind of situation. And if you don't get that reference, you're probably just too young. But just to note here that how people are born in this world is, specifically hidden from us. We also just play with the concept of what it means to be born in a lot of ways. But now let's turn to another kind of alien inhuman race that we can also select in the character creation screens as a preset if we want. So the character creation option here I'm talking about is Nightfolk. We're seeing another one of these common names being displayed here. They would not have called themselves Nightfolk, so we know these people are probably the Nox. So why in the world are they referred to only here as Nightfolk? I mean, I think it should be obvious, but it's just to highlight this point that we're being tricked with these names in some cases. But there's definitely one kind of confusing idea in the game. That's what these Nox people are somehow related to the Numan. That means that they're connected to Marica because of like family connection, but I think the actual explanation is a lot stranger than this. So the confusion all kind of surrounds this plot by the Black Knight assassins and that whole thing, but we know these assassins were known to be scions of the Eternal City, so they were Nox, or they were like descendants of the Nox people. Only when we explore Noxtella and these underground areas of the Nox, we learn that these Nox people are not normal people, and these people have silver blood, we learn, because they're being created of these silver tears. And we talked before about how births are kind of strange in this world, we don't know where they come from. Well, in the case of the Nox, we know that what they do is they just basically mimic other life forms, so they're not actually kind of alive themselves in a way. Maybe alive's not the right term, more like they don't have any identity outside of mimicking something else. Their true identity is just this formless mass of silver. However, when we kill the sorceress and the swordsman type characters, they don't just, they don't just decay into a puff of smoke or silver mist like we do when we die, or many other enemies. Like they leave a human body behind. So some of these Nox appear to be like more human than Tarnished are, actually. But the question has to be then, where does that human part come from? You know more things about the Nox. For example, at some point in history, they did something made the Greater Will angry, and then because of that, they got banished underground. And this is described as happening long ago, but that's how everything is described, so it's tough to know what that means. But we're pretty sure from in-game descriptions and things that whatever they did, Greater Will Mad was having to do with their mimic tiers. They probably mimicked one of the Greater Will's vassals, and then Estelle of the Natural Born Void came over and just bombed them into underground land. That's why we find them underground. So yeah, it's interesting. Like those giant elevators that we find, you'd probably think that they went from the top down, but no, actually these ones were probably constructed the opposite way, like from the bottom up. Like it's kind of the only way that it makes sense. And also that Estelle was working for the Greater Will for some reason. So when these Nox were underground, they somehow learned how to tame these ant creatures. And for whatever reason, these ants, when we kill them, they drop runes that are called Numan runes. And I feel like for people who are growing on trees, like these giant ants are going to be a big problem probably. This is probably why we find certain Numan runes when we kill them. Or these bodies that we find underground that these ants are eating. I mean, these are possibly Numan bodies. Like at any point, one of these silver blobs could have found some Numan DNA here in one of these bodies and just created one, I guess, somehow. I'm not really sure how silver tier magic works exactly. And we also know that the Nox are associated with this right to forgiveness and atonement because they are the ones who have the Night Sacred Tears that we also find underground. So clearly these Nox people had an important role within the society. It's just one now that's been kind of rejected and abandoned in favor of Marica's new Golden Order. I'm not saying those things happened necessarily at the same time. It's possible they didn't, but it's also possible that they did because anything's possible. Glowmite Queen tangent? Nope, not gonna go there. We also know that the Nox have a real bone to pick with Marica. They got a real beef with her, and that's why they helped Ronnie assassinate Godwin. But turning back to how all these things kind of got mixed up, so we've got Marica, who is rumored to be a Numan, so we've got that figured out. She's a tree-born descendant of these Numan people. So somehow Numans grow on trees, and one type of Numan that grows on a tree is the Shaman Numan. One of these Shaman Numan was a Marica Shaman Numan. I mean, we've got these Nox who have this sort of silver tier magic that they use to replicate or reproduce that way. And if they got in trouble replicating the vassal of the Greater Will at some point, and that could have been Marica, seems like at least a pretty good possibility. And if that's true, they would have taken this mimic magic as well as this replication ability of Marica with them underground. So later we get these Black Knife assassins. Now I think this could go in two possible directions. One possibility is that some of these more humanoid Nox people are just sort of clones of earlier Numan people that were, created by Nox tier, mimic tier magic. But they somehow became more humanoid, so that's still kind of unexplained. The other possibility is that these Black Knife assassins are mimic tiers actually, but not just any mimic tiers, they're possibly mimic tiers that they're using of Marica. And this is actually where the confusion comes from, because Nightfolk and Numan are clearly separate people. It's literally like apples and oranges. So if the Black Knife assassins are scions of the Eternal City, they can't also be Numan. They have to be these Nightfolk people, unless they got some part of Marica that they're able to use to replicate her and create mimic tiers. Or if not mimic tiers, or maybe a higher level like the ones we find with Silver Blood, it's just a higher level of the same thing. They're just replicating someone else. So when the Black Knife assassins are rumored to have close ties to Marica. So I think the close ties it is talking about is more like this mirroring effect that's happening. So it's just this mimicry. This is the idea of a close connection. But the other possibility with the Nox is that they're just mimicking the remains of one of Marica's relatives. So that could also be possible. But they'd be mimicking like the ancient dead remains, not like the new Numan remains. If that makes sense. But there's more interesting connections, I think, to these Nox people that haven't really been, fully explored. Let's talk about some more of those things. We know that the Nox are very much involved in magic and specifically sorcery. So the night sorcery or the Nox sorcery is all the stuff that's got the invisible projectiles. There's also one called Night Maiden's Mist, but it does damage to you when you cast it as well, so I don't use it too often. Where did we learn Night Maiden's Mist from? Well, our boy Gowry. Gowry is, of course, an NPC that we encounter in connection with Millicent's questline. And he tells us he used to be a sorcerer back in the old days, and he was definitely a Nox sorcerer. So he might know a thing or two about replications and creating mimic tiers. But what's interesting now about Gowry is he abandons sorcery and goes into incantations, actually. He becomes fascinated with Melania and the Scarlet Rot. And we should note that Gowry does not appear to be affected by the Scarlet Rot in any way. And we find Gowry in an area that's also associated with these giant plants that we saw in the obelisk that we were looking at before with the Numan. We also find these giant buds in the DLC area, close to the area called the Church of the Bud, actually. But back in Caelid, around these giant bud areas, we encounter some of Gowry's quote-unquote daughters. So there appears to be like several identical girls, just like Melania, that just appear randomly in the swamp of Caelid. and one of these random Melania clones we know as Millicent. You know, the question is like, is Gowry responsible for this somehow, or is this something that's just like happening by some natural way? But in any case, it definitely involves this tree magic stuff that he's interested in now with incantations, right? And this relationship with Gowry and Millicent is a little bit mysterious. Like, we never actually get to see them together. We know Gowry's actually trying to be forgotten. He doesn't want Millicent to know about him, so he just wants her to take off. But Gowry's motives are a little bit suspect. We know, like, he's really just interested in if Millicent can turn into like the new Melania, essentially. Like, that's his whole goal. Millicent may have other ideas of what she wants to be, so that's possible motivation for what she ends up doing in the end. But the weird thing about Scarlet Rot Affliction is it just erases your memories, so no matter what, Millicent's not really going to be like a fully formed person. Millicent's questline comes to an end, tragically, in a game like this. And this makes Gowry very upset. Now, if we kill him, we get a very good prize from killing him, so this is when you do it. Like Gowry taught you. One more little thing about Gowry. Well, we found Gowry in this town of Celia. We obviously find Nox people in Celia as well. They're the only like humanoids we find here that we fight against and steal that Lusat stuff. But the town of Celia itself, you notice, has the exact same building architecture that we find in another town, Ordina, liturgical town. And in Ordina we find both Black Knife assassins as well as Albinauric archers for some reason. And there's got to be an interesting connection here between the Albinaurics and, you know, the Nox of Black Knight Assassins, because they both have this similar silver blood. And if you want to extend it further, they both seem to be kind of synthetic people, meaning they were created by someone else, basically. And exploring these connections might be a topic for another video. The problem with this story is that one part connects to another and it just keeps going forever and ever, so you just have to, like, kind of stop it eventually. But just for now, one theory I have about the Albinaurics is, I mean, they obviously just kind of got scammed by Mikola, but I believe most likely, like, this giant cocoon that we find in Moog's palace is actually, like, the body of an Albinauric person. Like, probably one of these big Latana ladies or whatever. So maybe, like, Albinaurics have something to do with these portals? I don't know. I'm still working on that one. But we're going to abruptly cut things off here. That's why my voice is changing to this tone. And please, if you listen this far, click on subscribe for me. And if you are one of the couple people who have subscribed, thanks so much. Every click counts. Okay, bye-bye.